And I think looking at the life of the Buddha might be a good way to look at some things to inspire us, really. You know, the Buddha, this figure who attained enlightenment 2,500 years ago and managed to communicate that in a way that still talks to us here in Sheffield all those thousands of years later. We're a very different kind of people, presumably from the people at that time in India. But yet, the Dharma still talks to us. And you think of all those millions and millions of people over those 2,500 years who've been influenced by the Buddha. He is obviously one of, the world's great figures. So, so I thought, let's look at his life. And it's also timely, actually, because next week, about 20 people from Sheffield are going to go on a pilgrimage to India. Who's going to be going? Yeah, a few. Yeah, great. Ooh. And in fact, the Buddha himself suggested that people might go on pilgrimage, that it's a way to connect with him. And I've been myself, and I have found that's really true. It's by visiting these sites where the Buddha actually went, you do really connect with something. And hopefully, the people who are about to go on pilgrimage will connect with something, and we'll hear from them. We'll be sticking up on notices about how they're getting on and things like that. For people who do Facebook, hopefully there'll be things on Facebook as well. So we'll have a connection with them as they go on their pilgrimage. And they'll be visiting many places where the Buddha taught, where he lived, where he passed away, where he was enlightened. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling a brief life history of the Buddha, and then I'm going to focus on some aspects of his life that I'm particularly interested in. I'm going to look at going forth, what going forth means, and I'm also going to look at what's known as the fourth sight. And that's two different spellings of forth, just to be really confusing. So going forth is F-O-R-T-H, and then there's the fourth sight, which is like, the number fourth sight. Anyway. Okay, so the life of the Buddha. So he definitely was a real person who definitely lived. There's archaeological evidence that he was a real person. But because he lived about 2,500 years ago, you can imagine that there's a whole lot of myth around him, very difficult perhaps to know what was fact and what is myth. Sometimes I don't think it matters, because actually the myths can give us a much better sense of what was actually going on for him. But for instance, there's some argument with different scholars about when he was actually alive, and they differ in about 100 years to when he was born and when he died. So that's quite a big difference, isn't it? So we've got some knowledge of what the Buddha was like, but some, not a huge amount. We've got knowledge from what he wrote, and we've also got knowledge that other people wrote about him, and that's often several hundred years after he lived. So sometimes it becomes a little bit, a little bit of a story, perhaps. So I thought I'd start with what Buddha means. So Buddha's not a given name. It wasn't his given name. His given name was Siddhartha. And his name was Siddhartha, the name he was given, and Gautama was his clan name. Buddha means he who is awake. It means the one who has awoken, the one who knows reality, the wise one. So it's a descriptive word. So hopefully I'm going to call him Gautama before he was enlightened, and the Buddha after, but I wonder. Anyway, I'm going to give it a go. So, and he lived, 2,500 years ago in an area which is now northern India and southern Nepal. He came from a family where his father was very wealthy, very powerful. His father might have been something a bit like a president. It seemed that in the Shakya clan that he came from, there was a form of democracy that certainly the nobles would get together to make decisions. And it could have been that Siddhartha's father was the president of that gathering. He's also talked about as being a king. But whatever, he was definitely a very powerful and wealthy man. So Siddhartha was a young prince. He had the best of everything that he could have. A very good education. Probably couldn't read or write, actually. That wasn't part of something that very rich people did at that time. But he would have learned a lot from older people in his community. He had a very good training, probably in martial arts, in being a warrior. He came from a warrior caste. He would have led a very comfortable life, it sounds like, with no particular responsibilities. It sounds like his father was very loving, very affectionate. He was married. He had an arranged marriage, which was completely the normal thing at the time, and a young son. And lived, I think, a very comfortable life. I've heard Vidania compare his life to being a bit like it would be today if you were the son of a CEO of a big corporation. So you might, you'd go to the best schools, the best universities that money could buy. You'd go skiing in Switzerland and have holidays in Barbados and have sports cars and expensive clothes, motorbikes, that kind of, I think that's the kind of figure that he might have been. But despite all these comforts in his life, Siddhartha Gautama was dissatisfied. And we're going to explore that much later. He was dissatisfied, and he gave it all up, and he left home. He went forth. He went forth on a quest. So the story goes that one night there was a full moon, perhaps a bit like last night, a full moon, where Gautama rode away with his charioteer, came to a river, the boundaries of his lands, cut off his long hair, and became a homeless wanderer. He left behind his wife and son, and certainly when I heard that the first time, I was a bit, that didn't seem the kindest thing for a man to do. But I think times were very different then. It wasn't a nuclear family. The mother and son would have been completely financially supported in the bigger family. And I think also there was something about Siddhartha had a desperate need to make the world better for himself and for his wife and son. He was doing what he thought would be the best for his wife and son. He wasn't just dropping out because he couldn't hack it anymore. He was going on a quest of making the world a much better place. And he would have left his wife and his son perfectly well, looked after. So he went off, cutting off the ties with his family, becoming an individual, and leaving behind what most people in his culture would have said he needed to do to be happy. He really wanted to find the truth. And he searched for 6 years, and he went to many different teachers. And at that time in India, there were lots of different teachers around that you could go and learn with. And one way that many people who were looking for some kind of an answer would practice was what's called asceticism, which is basically self-torture. So they would do things like sit on a bed of nails. They were trying to kind of mortify the body, overcome the body. So they practiced austerities, going naked, not sleeping, not eating. Siddhartha Gautama was the best of all at these austerities. He became like a skeleton. He became really, really thin. And he was famous. He had his own disciples. But he found that even though he was practicing these horrible asceticisms, trying to overcome his body, it wasn't leading to enlightenment. It wasn't leading anywhere. So he felt that he wanted something different. He needed a different way to practice. And he remembered a state of mind that he'd entered into as a boy. So he'd been sitting under a rose apple tree as a boy, watching his father plough a field, which is kind of interesting, seeing as his father was like a president kind of figure, but perhaps his father was doing it as perhaps some kind of ritual, some kind of a traditional thing. But anyway, his father was ploughing a field, and Siddhartha sat there as a boy under this tree and found himself in a very calm, very focused state of mind, a very pleasurable and enjoyable state of mind. And in this state of mind, his mind was very pliable. He could really think clearly. And he wondered if there was something in this state of mind that he'd experienced as a boy, he might be able to make some progress. So he changed his plan and stopped being an ascetic, and he started to eat. The story goes that he accepted some food from a young woman. He accepted some rice pudding from a young woman and started eating again. And his disciples saw what he was doing, that he was eating, and they said, well, he's obviously, he's given up, he's backsliding, he's leading a life of luxury, and we're not going to follow him anymore, so they left him. So he was pretty much on his own, actually. He'd left his family and his clan. His disciples had left him, and he was all on his own. So what he decided to do was to get into that state of mind by meditating. And he went to a particular place with a lovely tree that he could sit under by a beautiful river. This place is now called Bodh Gaya, and the tree is sort of still there, and the river's there, but it's not very beautiful anymore. But Bodh Gaya is still quite an amazing place. So at that time, it was kind of out in, it was a wild place. So he sat under the tree and entered into a state of relaxed concentration and examined his mind and his experience, and examined his understanding of that world. And in that examination, he started to have a realization of how things really work, how things really are. So that on the night of the full moon of May, just as the morning star rose in the sky, he achieved full enlightenment. That's very hard to describe. I'm not going to even give it a go. But the light dawned and he became the Buddha. So from now on, he's the Buddha, the awakened one, the wise one. And so he'd ended his quest, but in a way it was the beginning of his mission, of his life's work. He was aged 35 then. And he spent 7 more weeks at Bodh Gaya absorbing this experience, including spending a whole week, I think it was, looking at the Bodhi tree that he'd sat under, looking at it with gratitude. And I'm going to come back to that. And then he left Bodh Gaya to go and see his old disciples. He walked to Sarnath, one of the places the pilgrimage will go to, which is about 100 miles away. And he expressed what he'd experienced in what's called the first sutta, the first thread, the first teaching. And gradually around him, a Buddhist community was formed, a Sangha, a community was formed. And he spent 45 years, a long time, walking around this area of North India, South Nepal. And he'd get to a village, have an alms round. Sometimes he had a companion, sometimes he was on his own. He'd maybe do the alms round. He lived completely on the food that people gave him. So if you imagine what that would be like to live completely on whatever people would give you, whether you liked it or not. And sometimes you would probably not get any food, so you would go to bed hungry, but he just lived on that. And after he had gathered alms and he had eaten, he'd sit under the mango grove, which apparently, well, again, people who are going to India will see the mango groves, sit under the mango grove, and the villagers would gather and he'd preach to them, he'd teach them. And he'd teach in a way that made sense to whoever he was teaching. So if he was talking to a farmer, he might use the kind of farming analogies. If he was talking to a king, he'd talk in a language that the king would understand. He was very good at teaching in a really appropriate way. And he did that for 9 months of the year. The other 3 months, in the rainy season, he would gather with other monks, with nuns perhaps, in one place, and they would practice together for 3 months. So over his lifetime, he eventually passed away when he was around about 80, achieved parinirvana as it's called. But over his lifetime, he will have met many thousands of people. And his disciples went out and taught, and they also met many thousands of people. So probably over his lifetime, many types of people, lay people, kings, peasants, men, women, will have heard him or his disciples teaching. And then, of course, over the last 2,500 years, it's spread around the world. Buddhism has at different times been really strong in different countries. In India itself, it was strong for a few thousand years or so, and then for various different reasons, it completely disappeared out of India until quite recently. So I think the Buddha could see how even his own teaching would come to a place, thrive, and then pass away. But luckily, his teaching survived in different places around the world. And so we've got it today. So that's the effect of the Buddha's life. So that's a really brief description of his life story. And if you were to read, so this is a book of his life story, Gautama Buddha, which is a really good book by someone called Vishvapani. And if you listen to Radio 4, to the Today programme, there's occasionally a Buddhist on doing Thought for the Day, and that's Vishvapani who wrote this book. So there's a lot around the story, and I've just told it very briefly. And what I'm going to do now is just concentrate on 3 aspects of that story. So the first is his going forth. So this is when he decided to leave his family, leave his clan, leave this very comfortable life. He was going to be as powerful as father one day. He was leaving all that behind. He went forth. Secondly, I'm going to talk about a couple of incidents around his actual enlightenment. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we created a context for other people to go forth and how we might be able to help be part of that project, I suppose. So looking at going forth, and I'm going to look at this from 2 angles. First of all, at the traditional story of him going forth, and then something from a sutta, from the teaching of the Buddha, probably the word of the Buddha himself. So the story goes that the Buddha, when he was living in his palaces, he had different palaces for different times of the year, and that he was very protected by his family, who didn't want him to see anything that might freak him out a bit. So he had lived a very, very protected life. And the story goes that he escaped from the palace, and he asked his charioteer to take him out into the local villages. And for the first time, he saw somebody who was like bent over a bit, tottering along, with no hair, and a long white beard and didn't look very well at all. So he saw this person and he said, well, who is this? Why is this person like this? And the charioteer said, it's an old man, an old man, of course. And the Buddha said, but how? Actually, it wasn't the Buddha yet, was it? It was Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama said, how? How did he get like this? And the charioteer said, of course, well, everybody gets like this if they live long enough. And the Buddha said, well, will it happen to me? And the charioteer said, yes, if you live long enough, it will happen to you. And this vision of somebody getting old, it said, struck the Buddha like a thunderbolt. He felt like, what was the whole point of all this youth and pleasure that he was having if this was how things were going to end for him and for other people? Now, of course, I think this is a mythical story. I don't expect he really was locked up in a place where he didn't see anybody aging. I think in a way it expressed that thing that many of us will have, that day where you or days where you look in the mirror and you go, I don't believe it, but I seem to have grey hairs. Or I don't believe it, but I can't run up those stairs quite as quickly as I used to before. When we kind of start, or maybe we see our parents aging. When we actually come to terms with the fact that we really will, ourselves and the people we love will get old, we see it in a different way. We really see it. So another time the Buddha went out, and this time he saw someone who was very ill, very sick. And again he said to the charioteer, what's going on here? Why is this person lying down? Why can't they get up and walk about? And Gautama said, the charioteer said, well, it's someone who's ill. And Gautama was like, what's this, getting ill? And again, it was that time when he saw for the first time that people really do get sick, that our bodies are fragile and impermanent, and that all of us will get ill. The third sight he saw was that of a corpse. So again, he went out with the charioteer, and at that time, and I think these days in India as well, it's much more public than it is here when somebody dies. So they'll carry the body of a dead person, through the streets and burn them. And people will come and follow the corpse and see the corpse. And I think you can imagine that if Siddhartha Gautama had never seen a dead body, he would be completely shocked. It is really shocking the first time. Many of us, I think, are protected from death. And the first time we see someone who is a dead body or we realize that someone has died, it's a really strong shock. And that's what happened to the Buddha. So he had these three sights. He saw someone who was old, somebody who was sick, and a dead body. So we'd call this an existential situation, an existential crisis, we'd call it now. It's when we realize that although we might be young and in our prime, we will get old. We will die, we will get sick. We really realize it. But yet, that's the thing we most don't want. We most don't want to die. So we have to live in this situation where we will die, but it's the thing we really don't want. It's this huge existential issue once we really realize it. And why is it? Why do we find ourselves in this situation? Is it because of God? Is it because of fate? What is it that causes this? These were the questions that the Gautama, the Buddha-to-be, was asking himself. And then he went out again with the charioteer and he saw what's called the fourth sight. And the fourth sight was what's known as a sadhu, or a holy man. So this was someone who was walking through the streets of the village. He seemed really calm, really relaxed, very confident, very happy, cheerful and kind, just walking through the village in a kind and generous way, but not getting caught up in all the drama. And the Buddha thought, that person knows something that I'd really like to know. That person has got some answers, and I need to find the same approach to life. So that's the crisis, that's the four sights that caused him to leave the palace when he was 29, to leave home, to try and find another way to understand the world. And of course, this can be our experience too, can't it? It can be like, in some ways, obviously we're not living the life of a prince, but our lives, compared to most lives that people have lived in the world, are pretty good in terms of material goods. And we can live a life where we're protected in some ways from the realities of illness and of death, of suffering, until we suddenly find ourselves really knowing it in our hearts. And then I think it can make everything else seem meaningless. I don't know if you've had that experience when it just seems like everything else is meaningless. And that's why he went off to find a different way of being. So that's one story. And I'll just say a little bit more about that before I go to the other approach. So I suppose for me, what does going forth like that mean? What does that mean? So I think for me, it's been like a gradual process of realizing in some ways, I don't think I know it deep in my heart that I will really die, but of realizing that that is the human condition, of realizing that we get ill, we suffer. And it's been slowly seen that I think in some ways I was protected from it when I was young. And I suppose there came a time when I was just like, well, what is all this suffering about? And I wanted to change something. And I tried lots of different things. I tried being involved with various political movements, thinking that might sort it out, and it didn't. And then I came, and I was very stressed in my life, to learn to meditate, and heard the teachings of the Buddha and thought, oh, that makes such a lot of sense. So perhaps hearing the teachings when I went along to my first Buddhist class was a bit like my fourth sight. It was like hearing a different way of seeing the world that really grabbed something in my imagination. I think after that, I gradually went forth. I gradually changed the way that I looked at some things. I no longer thought that my career, my relationship, my amount of money I had would give me complete happiness. I have to say, it's not like I've let go completely or gone forth from those things completely, but I could see gradually that I was turning away from that and perhaps more turning towards the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. So I think for me, for many years, it was definitely not something I did in an outside way. I still carried on in a career, and I had a boyfriend, and I had all this kind of stuff, and a house and everything. But then gradually, well, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, I've been in a position where I felt much more like making a more physical sense of going forth. So when I look at my life, in some ways I have gone forth quite a lot, as much as you can in the West. I haven't gone off and wandered in the forest on my own. But, I do live in a community now. I do work in at the centre in a right livelihood. I certainly don't see my life in terms of career anymore or how much money I can get. So I think for me and for many people, there's kind of like a mixture between changing our minds and our approach to people, but also that does sometimes need to be reflected in how we actually live as well. But only we all know what would work for us. So perhaps that's a question you could look at when you get in a group, is what would going forth mean to you? Because we go forth for a reason. We go forth to be happier. It's not something that anybody makes you do. It's not something you have to do as a kind of struggle or as a horrible thing. It's like going forth is something we do because we see that it leads us away from our suffering. Okay, so let's look at another angle into going forth. So this is a sutta. It's the Atadanda Sutta. And this was one of the very first, earliest Buddhist texts. So there's a huge wealth of Buddhist texts in the world, and some of them are probably written by the Buddha himself. It's hard to know because he was part of an oral tradition. He gave teachings, people remembered them, and then they passed them down. They learnt them off by heart, and they passed them down to another person who passed them down. And it was a few hundred years before they were actually written down. So, of course, they could have never have been said by the Buddha himself. They could have been corrupted by people hearing them. It's difficult to know. But there are certain teachings where I definitely get the feeling of whoever said it certainly hadn't really amazing insight into reality, and this is one of them. So this is the Buddha. He's enlightened, and he's talking about his experience before he was enlightened. He says, "Fear is born from arming oneself." So fear is born from arming oneself, which is interesting because that's the opposite of what we normally think. We normally think we're frightened, so we better arm ourselves and get all that kind of defensiveness on and all that. And he's actually saying it's the other way around. It's like fear comes from arming ourselves. Just see how many people fight. I'll tell you about the dreadful fear that caused me to shake all over. Seeing creatures flopping around like fish in water too shallow, so hostile to one another. Seeing this, I became afraid. So seeing creatures flopping around like fish in water too shallow, so hostile to one another. Seeing this, I became afraid. This world completely lacks essence. It trembles in all directions. I longed to find myself a place unscathed, but I could not see it. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. Which is a strong word, isn't it? I became completely distraught. But then I discerned here a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions, so that if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down. So he says he was distraught with seeing this incredibly strong image, I think, of people and beings being like fish. You know, when the water's kind of going down and fish are trapped and they're trying desperately to get some oxygen and competing with each other as well, so hostile to one another. And so the Buddha, before he was enlightened, found himself looking for a place unscathed where he could hide from this suffering, but he didn't find a place like that. And he became completely distraught seeing people in conflict. But what he then realized was that it was because there's a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. And it's when we're pierced by this thorn that we run in all these directions. And if we take the thorn out, we don't run, we settle down. So it's the thorn, it's like we are creating much of our suffering. And as we run around trying to fill something up, trying to compete with other people, we're just creating more problems for ourselves. We make our life really difficult. So it's a bit like he's looked into his own heart and he saw how wounded he was, that he was wounded with this thorn in his heart, that the fundamental cause of the suffering was in his own heart. So it's a very strong experience that he had. And he then had a powerful urge to pull out that thorn and to help other people pull out that thorn. So what he did is he rejected the ideas that didn't work for him anymore, so being a prince, living in a palace, or doing all the ascetic practices, and followed his intuition, looked intently at his own mind, got himself in a state where he could look at his own experience and examine it, and found a way to understand how his mind was shaping his own experience. So he saw that his own consciousness was determined by his conditions. And you could say that he sat underneath that Bodhi tree and removed that thorn from his heart. And he found he could find a new way of being in the world. So, of course, all his teachings that we look at are different ways of how to remove that thorn of self-obsession, that thorn of craving, of aversion, of ignorance, how to remove that thorn. We can do it through practicing ethics, meditation and wisdom, through the Noble Eightfold Path that we looked at in the intermediate course. And we can become, like the Buddha, that fourth sight, walking in the world with kindness. So we can become part of the solution and not part of the problem. So I think that's interesting that there are two different ways that you might see going forth, and there's lots of different ways. So one is the traditional image, which is somebody who really comes to terms, or really sees the existential crisis we're all in, and then looks for a way out of that. And the second is a person who is suffering because they see it's a thorn in our own hearts, everybody's thorn in their own hearts that is causing so much suffering. And there's two different ways that the Buddha tried to go away from, tried to find a freedom from when he sat down under that tree and meditated. Okay, so he sat down under the tree and he meditated, and there are lots of stories around his enlightenment, and I'm sure we will hear more of them over the year. But there's one particular thing that I just really love that I mentioned before. So he was enlightened, and he spent 7 weeks absorbing that. And one of those weeks he spent gazing with love at the Bodhi tree that he'd sat under. He gazed with gratitude at this great tree that he'd sat under when he was enlightened. And I just really love that for lots of reasons. I think one, because, well, there he is, he's enlightened, and what does he do? One of the first things he does is he spends a lot of time appreciating the conditions that have allowed him to get where he is. And part of those conditions are represented by the tree. I think the tree here represents all the conditions that led to him to be able to become enlightened. So he's not going, I'm so cool, I'm the Buddha, and I'm enlightened. He's much more going, he's really seeing and appreciating what has led him to be in that situation. And also I think trees, they're part of the natural world. There's something where he's connected with the natural world. He's not different from the natural world. Enlightenment is not an unnatural thing. It is something that has flown from sitting under a tree. And I also particularly like it because I do think that gratitude is such a radical practice and such a simple practice. Gratitude is a practice that anybody can do. My own experience of sitting down at night and writing down 5 things that I'm grateful for makes a massive difference to my life. If I'm starting to get down or depressed, if I just start to do that, it's amazing what a difference. And it is, I know, I think people who help people with mental health problems, nurses and people, will use the gratitude exercise as a way for people to become much happier. It just changes around. It's so radical. It changes around the way we see the world. Instead of it all being about what can I get from the world and what am I missing, what's the lack in my life, it's much more about being in touch with what we already have, the extraordinary amount that we already have and the conditions we have. And I think it's radical in a way because it's very much... perhaps that thorn we have in our heart comes from thinking that we don't have enough and that other people have got more and that we need, and we need to kind of get rid of other people so that we can have what we want. But actually, if we already appreciate what we have, we don't need to engage in that craving and therefore that pushing people away. We have I think we're much more in touch with how things really are. So I do think, this gratitude that he feels for the tree, I just really like it. And something that's linked to that, actually, that also happens around his enlightenment, before his enlightenment, is I love the idea that the food he takes some rice pudding from, she's called a milkmaid, but I'm not sure that's a brilliant term, but anyway, from a young woman who's carrying some milk. And he eats that. And so it's a bit like he's moved from being an ascetic, where he's not eating anything, he's kind of living a really unnatural life, to realizing that he's a human being, having some rice pudding, looking after his body so that he's then well enough to go and sit under the tree and get enlightened. And although we don't practice those physical asceticism in our lives, unless you go fell running or something like that, most people don't actually, or swimming outside in the winter, which some people do. Most people don't actually go out and self-torture their body particularly. But what we do perhaps is quite a lot of mental self-torture. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time beating themselves up, telling themselves they're not good enough. Just like not looking after themselves in a kind of mental way. It's like we need some kindness. I think we need some mental rice pudding sometimes. We just need to have a bit of kindness, a bit of self-metta, so then we can meditate and then we can get in touch with how things really are. Okay, so that's the second thing I'm talking about, which is around his enlightenment. And then the third aspect of his life that I'm particularly inspired by at the moment is the way that the Buddha created Sangha and spiritual community. So for the rest of his life, once he was enlightened, as I said, he travelled around North India and southern Nepal. He just walked from place to place. And he would come to a place and teach people. And as he taught people, people would become enlightened. They would catch the spark of the Dharma from the Buddha. And they would want to join, or they wouldn't become enlightened, but they'd still want to join his community. They'd ask to join his community. Some people wanted to do it as monks and nuns. Other people were lay people. But people from all walks of life were inspired by meeting the Buddha or hearing his teaching and wanted to also practice. And gradually, slowly, this whole kind of community grew of people who had learnt the teaching of the Buddha and then passed it on to other people. And the Buddha encouraged people to do 2 different things, at least. One of them was to spend some time alone, to go into the forest, to have experience of solitude, so to go away from the crowds. And like the Buddha sat on his own under the tree and experienced those mental states in which he saw reality, and he wanted other people to have that opportunity. So that's a really important part of practice, is time where you meditate, time where you go on retreat on your own or with other people, but time where you go away. But there's also a really important part of the spiritual life is getting together with other people. So the Buddha was very clear that monks and nuns needed to meet together very regularly. And it's very important for the growth of the Sangha for it to meet in large numbers. So both having time alone, but also meeting with other people. And that's what we try and do here at Sheffield Buddhist Centre in a small way. We're trying to create a community in which we can all work together on removing that thorn from our hearts, where we can help other people to remove the thorn from their hearts. We want to show like a different way of living, based on kindness and generosity, on integrity, on mindfulness and metta, a place where we are living as much as we can from the Buddha's teachings. Yeah, and that we can be a fourth sight in doing that. So we can, when we go out into the world, those of us who have jobs or have families, friends, we go out and we are showing a different way of being. And here at the centre as well, we're demonstrating a different way of being with us, a fourth sight. And we can support each other. We can support each other to have times of solitude, for instance, to practice. So we have to meditate. So we brought on retreats. So if you're the kind of person who plans their year ahead, I'll just draw your attention to a few things. So there's a Sangha retreat in April for a weekend. If you haven't yet been on a Sangha retreat, that's a really good thing to go on. We're going to have an urban retreat in March, which is a really interesting thing because we stay here and we go about our ordinary lives, but we practice more intensely. So an urban retreat can be quite a transformative thing. If you've already been on some Sangha retreats, you might start, or some weekend retreats, you might think, oh, I might look up and see if there's a week's retreat I could go on, or a 5-day retreat I could go on, and go away and go to a different centre with different people, but have a chance to practice away from your normal life. And of course, we also support each other as we practice to become more ethical, to communicate the Dharma to each other. So I suppose I'm very inspired by this vision of us at Sheffield Buddhist Centre, creating a place for us to all grow. I don't think we can be naive about the fact that just calling yourself a Buddhist isn't going to change anything. I mean, as we all know, people who call themselves Buddhists have done some terrible things, like recently in Myanmar. So it's not enough just to call yourself a Buddhist. There's something about we actually need to be practicing together. And I think that's what we can do together. So I suppose I do believe that we can learn from the Buddha, and we can create the conditions for our Sangha to be a place where we take those thorns out of our own hearts, where we become a fourth sight for others, and here at the centre. And we follow in the footsteps of the Buddha.